So it is my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Kirsty Bell, who you already met through her short presentation. Dr. Bell is a senior research fellow at the Charles Perkins Centre at University of Sydney, and she's also the principal fellow who established and is leading the Australian T1D national screening pilot. And she will also be moderating our discussion with the panel. And please feel free to ask the questions also from the audience. We have roving mics as well to ask the questions. And thank you for all of you who submitted the questions through our app. So welcome, Kirsty.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'd say the panel today is really going to focus on the progress towards early detection and primary prevention. So thinking back on, where have we gone and where are we going? And we've had such two fabulous keynotes this morning that have really kind of covered the span, but I want to narrow our focus back down to that screening and primary prevention because we've got some great content this afternoon. Moving on to secondary prevention. So Jared has kindly introduced me, but I'd like to pass to our panel members to each introduce themselves. Would you like to start, Gina?
Yes. My name is Gina Agiostratidou, and I'm the director of the Type 1 Diabetes Program at the Helmsley Trust.
I'm Gina Couper, and I spoke previously from Adelaide.
Oh, hi, I'm Renza, Scibilia. I have 25 years of Type 1 diabetes lived experience. I'm with the JDRF International team, the Global Access team. I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Communications of that team.
So I'm Melanie Cullen. I work for JDRF in the insulin pump program and mental health lead. I also have a son with Type 1 who's had Type 1 since he was 2. He's now 18. And I also have a history and background in psychology, so worked in diabetes services over the years as well.
Marian Rewers from Denver, Colorado. I was introduced not long ago.
John Wentworth from Melbourne. I have an interest in screening and immunotherapy to prevent type 1 diabetes.
Edwin Kirk from Sydney. I'm a clinical geneticist and genetic pathologist. I have an interest in screening, but mainly reproductive genetic carrier screening. I feel like a bit of a fraud, although I can spell diabetes.
My name is Bill Rawlinson. I'm a medical virologist, and I'm not Maria Craig, but I do work with her and with Key Wook at Prince of Wales and the University of New South Wales.
Fabulous. It's an esteemed panel. I'm very lucky to be among such good company. So we're going to cover a range of topics this morning, and I think it's great that we've got such a diverse experience and expertise on this panel. So I'm going to open it with something really broad and very easy to answer. In the area of screening, what do you consider our greatest achievement in the past decade? I'm going to throw, Jenny, should I put you on the spot? What's it? Yep. What do you think is our greatest achievement so far?
I think, it's a difficult one because is it the genetic risk scores becoming refined, or is it the great understanding of the evolution of adult immunity to enhance that? But it's certainly, it seems pretty amazing really how quickly that has come together, those two options.
Gina, do you want to add to that?
If you think about 10 years ago, we were thinking about either genetic screening or autoantibody screening, and probably was not possible. But today, as we heard, we have in Germany, in the US, in Australia, you have screenings that are happening, and I think this is wonderful that we are able to identify children, educate families before type 1 diabetes is diagnosed. So I think it's really wonderful that we are able to have functional, it's operational. We know that.
Absolutely. Before I move on, anyone else who wants to jump in? Marian, please.
I respectfully disagree. I think teplizumab approval now in the US and hopefully in more countries soon is a game changer. It's not a perfect drug to prevent or even delay diabetes, but it's a proof of principles that we can develop and bring to the market such medication. It makes the screening and all that more important and acceptable to the general population.
So it's kind of the clinical scientific, I don't know, Renza or Mel, if you want to add something more from the personal aspects.
I was just thinking that the fact that we now have an option, so if your child is in the screening and they find out that they've got antibodies, then there's options that you can do. I think that is so exciting and it makes a world of difference.
And has that changed your personal feeling about screening kind of along the way, or have you kind of always held that?
Yeah, look, I think we still, I remember getting my daughter screened when she was younger just because I wanted to know, not that I could do anything about it. And I always sort of thought, I'm going to pick it up if something happens anyway with her. I'm going to pick it up earlier than I would have with my son. But the fact now, I've spoke to many families over the years through when I was working in diabetes services that really didn't want to get the testing done because there's nothing that they can do. There's nothing, why find out? What's the point of the increased anxiety? But I think the fact that there's now options in the future that are really there to help prevent is amazing. And, if we can prevent DKA, and my son was quite severely in DKA when he was diagnosed, he was only 2. So, if we can prevent that, then we've heard all morning how much of a difference that makes in terms of their long-term, care. So,
and my experience was that when my daughter was born, she's 18 now, was that I was one of those people who my own anxiety was just already through the roof. So the fact that what was there that we could do then, and I knew that there were things, but there wasn't anything concrete enough for me to say I can see the benefit of this. I was going to be the same. I'd be looking out for things. But now that she's 18, she gets to make that decision herself. It's her problem now, but she's very keen now to have the conversation. So we'll see where we go there.
Interesting. I'll throw it to the other end of the table a little bit. John, I guess your experiences with screening family members, do you want to kind of share a little bit about the insights you've learnt through that?
Well, I was going to agree with Marian that I think the greatest achievement of screening is prevention because, it's a chicken and egg problem that we're slowly solving. The experience that I've had screening predominantly families with type 1 diabetes is that about 50% don't want to do it, and we're quite happy to respect that. The sales pitch we have is we can look after you if you screen positive and help. Particularly by preventing DKA, and a lot of people say, well, I don't need that, and I don't need to live with the worry that knowing my child has antibodies will give me for however long it lasts. And similarly, on the whole, people who screen positive have been, accepting and sort of glad to have known that information, but there have been instances where people really didn't want that. And we've had a couple of discussions with our ethics committee about, adverse events essentially related to this, and we've sort of refined our approach to getting the information out and screening. But it is still a big issue. It will always be an issue, I think how people react to that news is highly variable, and there will be some people for whom it really is not the best thing in their life, and they probably shouldn't have got the screening done in the first place. And I don't think we'll ever be able to prevent that in its entirety.
I mean, if I can add, Kirsty, to that sort of Australian perspective, even in India, with the additional substantial investigation in addition to screening, because it's not really a sort of screening program per se, there are families who do not wish to know the results of their antibody test. So,
and I wondered if I can throw in my own comments and things around that. I wonder if it is different in family members versus the general community, because one of the big things we talk about screening at the moment is trying to soften the introduction to type 1. So rather than it being, and I use Colin Diane's analogy of it being kind of a crash landing, and the first that they're learning about type 1 is in the hospital at the bedside, and they're starting insulin the same day, is for the general population, can we slow and smooth in that introduction? And stepwise, the education around what is type 1, around blood glucose monitoring, and then eventually around insulin introduction when that's appropriate. And I do wonder, for families with type 1, they already know what life is like, they already know symptoms, and they're already going to be picked up because there's a risk. potentially. So, you know, when they're starting to present with symptoms, there's a heightened awareness amongst health professionals. For the general community, 9 out of 10 families, that's not there. So I do wonder, you know, I think we really do need to look at community on both sides as well around those reactions.
So if I may add,
Please.
In terms of monitoring high-risk children or adults, I think CGM is a game changer because it was so mystical and you know, hard to explain to the families. A1C, OGTT, half of those people don't want to do OGTTs. Now CGM lays out the reaction to this meal, this snack, exercise, stress in front of you. You can see it. And our experience using blinded versus unblinded CGM in this space is that most families really love unblinded CGM without any alarms. And this is a request to the industry to remove low blood sugar alarms for that particular group of users. You know, that it's not nice to be waken up in the middle of the night with blood sugar of, let's say, 61, right, which may be completely normal for this pre-diabetic antibody-positive child. So I think CGM is the second most important game changer, but in the space of monitoring and also monitoring effectiveness of an intervention.
Do you want to add?
So can I we're very interested in screening from an infectious diseases point of view, and there are two aspects that I saw as important. And I guess the first one is that in terms of infectious diseases, if you're looking at future risk, if you don't counsel people, then you have adverse consequences of screening, and there's very good evidence that that's about 30% of the population. If you do, then that reduces to an acceptable sort of 1 to 2%. So the whole point about screening in my area is that if you don't counsel, then you have a problem, but if you do, you don't. Mm-hmm. And the second thing that may be obvious to everybody here is that regulation, and our interest is in Guthrie's cards and birth screening. The regulations around that are changing so rapidly that storage of cards and their use and their medico-legal use is becoming a significant impediment to this. If you look at Australian states, treatment of Guthrie's cards is completely different, almost completely different between every state. Some retaining them for life, some not. And there have been legal challenges that have forced that change to maintenance of those cards for life back to 2 years, and those legal challenges have changed that practice over a period of just a year or two. So there's a very high risk with any screening and storage that there will be a challenge and that those rules will be changed almost overnight.
Can I just make a comment? From a community perspective, I think there are two challenges. So I'm talking community of people with diabetes. One, talking prevention of type 1 diabetes is a massive leap for people to make. We simply haven't spoken about that. We talk about prevention or risk reduction of complications, but we haven't spoken about that in terms of primary prevention. And I think that's a real struggle for some people. So being clear about how we're communicating that, I think, is really important. And I think with that comes a lot of education around talking about the different stages of type 1. Because for so many people, especially where there was that really acute onset, it's either yesterday I didn't have type 1, today I do. And that's how people think of it. So really working with the community to re-educate about the stages so people understand there is real value in screening because we can do something. So I think that these are really important conversations to have, and being very mindful of just the emotional challenges people will be having as well.
Absolutely. And I think you've all touched on 3 really big topics here, so I kind of want to go into them in a little bit. So I'm going to come back to the education and the psychology piece because I want to explore that in a lot more detail. Before we do that, I want to kind of come back to Bill and talk about things we can learn from your experiences. I know you're heavily involved in COVID and things like that. Are there things that we can learn from other screening programs that you think we should, be exploring here?
Well, I guess those 2 points, that if you don't take care of the legal and other aspects at the start, and Edward probably knows more about this than me. But if you don't take care of those, it'll only take one legal challenge to change it, and it doesn't matter, in a sense, how much community support you have. I mean, it's very important, and we do that as well, obviously. It's extremely important. However, if there is a legal challenge, that sort of overrides it, and that's been done in Victoria. There's a very famous case in Victoria that changed it. There's a famous case in Texas that within 3 months meant that 6 million cards were disposed of. So I guess my point is that you have to, it's enormously important to engage with the community. I'm not disagreeing with that, but you also have to engage with the legal processes, which is part of the community way that we rule ourselves. And if you don't do that, you can have very rapid adverse consequences. I think the second thing is there are enormous technical challenges, particularly when you start doing COVID antibodies on cards, or you start doing infectious diseases on cards, or you start monitoring for autoimmunity on cards, because if you don't have a defined pathogenesis, if you can't absolutely say that this is going to result, you have in a problem, in this case, beta cell destruction and diabetes, if you can't be sure of that, the conversation becomes very rapidly very messy. I'm sure I would have thought you all know this. I mean, so I'm not being patronising, but for us, that has been an enormously difficult problem, because once you get to that point and you can't say, well, this is going to happen and therefore you need to do this process, they say, well, what do you think is going to happen? Well, it might happen, it might not. How sure are you? Well, there are these studies, and everybody's eyes glaze over. So I think that a very clear public health message, we have an intervention, or several interventions, some of which are preventive and they will save lives, is the first step. And again, that's pretty obvious to everybody. And I think the third thing is just to come back, there are significant technical challenges. There's cross-contamination, there's mixing up of cards. There's a famous case of somebody who received another child's cards when the parents requested the child's cards. That led to a change in legislation. So I run a number of quality assurance programs in serology as well as in molecular testing. And if we don't get that right, one single error is absolutely critical. And to get that right, you need masses of money. You need enormous amounts of money and enormous amounts of time. So enthusiastic, intelligent people is not enough. And I think that in this setting, in terms of handling millions of cards, it's a massive technical, very simple techniques, get it right. But if you don't get it right, then it has a massive impact. And you only have to get it wrong once, as we say.
Marian?
So I'm in the same camp with Bill for different reasons. And it's based on 2 lines of evidence. One is modeling using existing data, and the other is actually a study that has been going on for quite some time. Let's start from the modeling. It was an effort initiated by Janssen R&D with Jessica Dunn, Bob Noyson, and a few others. Mark Treisham did the modeling, and when you start from 100% of kids who are born, about 95% actually completes the newborn screening and has enough material left for anything else. So we are losing 5% of the population of the top. Then the existing GRSs for type 1 diabetes will miss between 20 to 30% of future cases of diabetes. Even if you label 10% of kids as at risk, about 20 to 30%, depending on the ethnic mix of future cases of diabetes, will not be classified as at risk. So they will not get any follow-up. Then, in whatever your healthcare system is, you have to track the 10% that you labeled at risk. And in any healthcare system, especially American, you are going to lose a large number of kids who move, who change insurance, whose parents don't want to hear from you again. So the losses accumulate. And at the end of this waterfall modeling, Mark came to a conclusion that you are going to detect only 24% of future cases of diabetes using your cohort 1 and cohort 2 approaches. You are going to lose most of the future cases of diabetes. They will never be detected. They will not get antibody testing on time. So this just fails any criteria for public health screening for late onset disease, not to mention the ethical concerns mentioned. And then there's a study called PRIMET in Virginia, United States, in the state of Virginia. Steve Rich, who is probably the top geneticist in type 1 diabetes space, and Boris Kovacevic, who is a top pediatrician and behind many algorithms for hybrid closed loops, put their heads together, got millions from endowment, and tried to implement the kind of cohort 2 approach. And they failed. They cannot find most of the cases that were classified as high risk using GRS. And even if they find them, they hear often, leave me alone. I mean, my kid was screened for diabetes and he doesn't have diabetes. So I don't want to do anything else. So there's a lot of problems, societal problems and technical problems to overcome. And I talk with Annette Ziegler often, and she shares the same view that for the time being, it's better to stick to approach 3, where you screen for islet autoantibodies, because it's a tangible outcome that you can actually interpret quite easily and do something about it based on the availability of trials or clinically approved treatment, and monitoring for dysglycemia and to prevent DKA. I would not go into a pathway that labels 10% or more of kids as high risk for late onset disease, and most of the disease is actually diagnosed in adulthood.
Bill?
Are we allowed to ask questions?
Yes, and also I guess the audience as well, and I'm kind of trying to monitor Slido as well, so trying to cover everyone.
Can I just ask, if that population that aren't screened and that don't, that don't subsequently get diagnosed, is there any evidence that they have a higher risk of type 1 diabetes? Because there certainly is in other settings. They're a higher risk for adverse pregnancy outcomes, for a whole range of adverse outcomes. But is there ever been a study that's actually looked at them and showed what their risk is for type 1 diabetes?
You're asking me?
Well, I guess I'm asking everybody because it's a sort of it's an illogical study because you can't screen them, but you can follow them up, for example, for infectious diseases, and they have a much higher risk. They have a much higher risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes, of STIs, of bloodborne virus infections, and early death, for example.
Well, I think polygenic diseases like type 1 or celiac disease or autoimmune thyroid disease are hard to predict based on genetics alone. Yeah. This is the bottom line. Even the best GRSs are going to fail in many cases.
And they've got limitations because so much of the data is based on people of European ancestry.
That's true.
So in a diverse population like ours, you run into huge headwinds.
Edwin, can I get you to kind of follow up that, because you've got a lot of experience in this genetic risk as part of McKenzies Mission. I don't know if you need to give a quick summary of what McKenzies Mission is first, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on this space.
Oh yeah, sure. So McKenzies Mission is a project where we screened a bit over 9,000 couples with carrier status for about 1,300 different genes, with the goal of introducing reproductive genetic carrier screening as a population-wide test that any couple who wants to access it could. And certainly hearing, the various comments, I'm hearing sort of similar themes emerging about societal acceptability, and I guess the fact that any screening test has potential harms as well as benefits, and you've got to, obviously try and maximise the benefits, minimise the harms, but you can't ever make the harms go away. You're always going to hurt some of the people you screen, and so the communication, the counselling that people receive beforehand is absolutely critical. and then appropriate follow-up afterwards. And the resource requirements are very substantial, there's no doubt about that. Yeah. And that's dealing with rare conditions, although collectively not so rare, which is a somewhat different space from this.
Marian, I kind of want to touch on some, because I think you raised some really good points, but we also have to consider, I guess, which of those holes that you talked about losing people, can we actually plug with different systems? And I think one of the benefits of Australia is we do have quite a federal system. We have national registries where we do follow people, you know, whether they move state or, you know, things like that. And their health insurance and Medicare is kind of national. So I think we are looking in a different landscape, and I think we do. While I'd love to, you know, and we have to learn lessons from everywhere around the world, and this has to be a global effort. I think there are unique healthcare system and geographies and population responses, you know, to consider as well. I don't think we can sort of instantly rule out. And I think landscape, you know, newborn screening landscape, you know, they're introducing genomic screening and. You know, yeah, I think there's so much fascinating things happening in this space.
I think it has to be tried, because we cannot assume that we will fail even not trying. And I've screened 100,000 kids for genetic risk in Colorado, 30,000 for Daisy and 75,000 for Teddy. We screened them using a much simpler approach, just based on HLA class 2. But the purpose was very different. Mm-hmm. We told all of the screened families that we are looking for the highest 5% or 10% of the population, highest risk, to do research, to find environmental factors that trigger autoimmunity, not to prevent diabetes. And in that screening, we know that we are missing 50% of the future cases. We are focusing on the highest risk groups. But from public health perspective, it's unacceptable to miss 50% of future cases in your screen for disease.
Cullen, yes.
I mean, we're missing all of them now. Right?
Yeah.
The one we can prevent at all, we can't find anyone. So 24% is better than 0%.
Right, but yet
we're not going to say we're going to eradicate the disease.
It's a lot of money to spend to get 24%, I guess,
yeah.
of the general population.
Yeah, and you are thinking about positive side, glass half full. But what are you going to tell to the families you told your child is not at risk of type 1 diabetes, and then the kid gets diabetes?
I'd be interested in your comments on that, because that's what happens today. At least we didn't tell them they were never going to get it, and then they did. And it was a question I put in there that 10% of them were definitely going to miss because they're antibody negative, and they always will be. I just spin that around, last little comment, which was back to John to say, is the most challenging conversation the single antibody positive result? Because you are emphasizing that people don't want to live with that uncertainty.
No, that's a good conversation. That's always, your risk is pretty modest, 10% lifetime risk. We want to keep an eye on it, make sure you don't get more. But I find those conversations a lot easier. And, you know, it's always a bit of a sales job on the phone as to how you want to sort of communicate things. But, I mean, you know, the reality is that if you track along at one antibody for a while, you're going to be fine. And we're screening people average age about 9, 10 years old, so most of the singles will probably remain single, the ones we pick up. Most of the multis we pick up on the first screen. But it would get a much more difficult conversation if we delve into the very young ones, as we do with India. And those singles I have a few of those conversations, and they are a bit more difficult because you've got to watch and wait. And you simply say, well, look, it's okay, you know, there's not a big risk at the moment, but let's see what happens, and if it stays at 1, that's going to be great. That's the message. Or goes to none, that's going to be great as well.
So
I'm going to throw to Fergus, and then I just heard someone else's voice. Yep.
Marian, I'm just wondering about, in the US system, how much healthcare insurance plays into the thinking of people when you're giving them a risk of a future disease they may or may not get, and who gets that information. Is that a real issue, or is it just a theoretical issue?
This is not the next frontier. The next frontier are pediatricians. We have to convince primary care providers and the American Academy of Pediatrics that it makes sense, that we are asking them to do a lot of work to not only screen but also follow and rescreen. I'm working with those guys, and they are already busy up to their eyeballs, and unless there's an obvious benefit, they are not going to do it.
But maybe that's where the lawyers help out here. You just have a case of, you know, DKA that could have been diagnosed.
Well, it's happening all the time, right?
I guess that's kind of our approach, is we're trying to run the screening program out without overburdening primary care, so that we can give them the red flag to say, you know, this child you need to watch out for, rather than leaving them in the dark and hoping they can pick up the signs and symptoms when they usually will only see one case in their whole career. And we're trying to give them the advance warning and take the work away. Okay, I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit because I want to come back to that anxiety piece about it. And Renza, you kind of touched on it a little bit. And Mel, I'd love you with your psychology background to kind of talk around, you know, what do the considerations here and how the education piece to this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've sort of got mixing my psychologist and my mum hat up a fair bit here, because I was just thinking that when I had my daughter, I was pregnant with her when my son was diagnosed, and I think I just kind of automatically thought that she was going to get it. So I'd already put myself in the headspace that this is what's going to happen. So screening, we got her screened. She just thought, oh, it's going to happen. If it comes back negative, then I can breathe a bit. But so I think it's really interesting. It's interesting in terms of listening to. Trying to think of how I would feel. I still want to know. My son was quite unwell when he was diagnosed, and listening to everything today and all the stuff I know, and I normally have my blinkers on to keep out of my sight. You know, if he was quite unwell and the diagnosis took way too long in hospital, lots of things missed, and you know, has affected his control, his management over the years. So I think if I'd known more about it, I mean, I had some understanding about diabetes, but if I knew more about it then I would have been able to pick up some of the symptoms then, you know, and that long term, you know, in terms of all our mum guilt and our anxiety and all these sorts of things that come in, that's a massive part. And if we can prevent that by educating and giving people those skills to understand those little bits, then to me that outweighs, you know, the anxiety and the risk that we get without knowing that.
Yeah, anxiety is real, and most studies show that it goes a little bit away, especially among fathers. Fathers kind of get rid of the problem almost in 2 or 3 months, but moms, especially multiple antibody positive kids, moms, worry all the time. They may normalize a little bit, but never as a group go below the population threshold for anxiety, and it's natural. I mean, there's and there's no medication for this too. So unless there's a good prevention that we can apply right away or soon, right? And another thing is the risk perception. In our studies, especially in ASK, we were shocked that the risk perception to be able to really tell if your child is at higher risk, moderate risk, or general population risk is not improving very fast. We do all of this education, informed consent to screen, and then a lot of explanation, lots of talking, meeting face-to-face, but people hear what they want to hear. And it's not uncommon that they have a false perception of low risk because they want to believe it, or high anxiety because of all of the stuff that happened in their lives that makes them more worried. So there's, I mean, human psychology is complicated.
I spent a lot of time needing to deal with that because I was the one who had I have type 1. I'm the only person in my family with diabetes, so type 1 diabetes. We do have lots of other we collect autoimmune conditions, like people collect China owls. But I had the rational side of my brain understood very much what that risk was. I could look at numbers and it made sense. But the mum guilt side of my brain was, if this happens, it's all my fault. And it's going to happen, and thank goodness that I was able to access a psychologist who could help me work through that, because, and you know, I mean, I think we need to think about how that manifests. You know, I started a mum's group of women with diabetes. We all had our kids around the same time, and one of the women was checking her child's glucose levels every single night while her child was asleep. And she knew that wasn't healthy, but that was something that she could do to feel some semblance of control in a situation where she felt that there was no control. You know, I think we're dealing with big issues, and when you've got a parent with diabetes where we feel that there is going to be blame or fault, even if it's only us who feel that way, that's something that needs to be considered.
So this really feeds into the performance of your screening method. The screening, whatever it is, 1 antibody, 4 antibodies, 1 method, 2 methods, it has to be sensitive, not to miss too many cases, but it also has to be very specific to provide this reassuring message to 99% of the population. 99% of the general population, kids, are not going to get truly autoantibodies and diabetes. And 97% of kids in families like yours are not going to get antibodies and diabetes. This is the most powerful positive message we can share. Your kid is not at risk. It's negative. We confirmed it. Yeah, maybe we need to rescreen it just in case in 2-3 years. But at least as of now, no problem. Wouldn't this be a positive information?
Absolutely, and again, rational side of my brain knows that. The irrational side goes, but my kid gets it, that's 100%. So, you know, the messaging is important, but I think, you know, and I remember I've spoken with John so much about this, and you know, we've done live Q&As about it, and this is one of the things that keeps coming up, because one of the other things that I hear from people in the community that I think we need to address, and this is, you know, parents of kids with a child with diabetes now saying their fear is that if we can prevent type 1, what happens to their kid? So there's so many, you know, their kid's going to be forgotten is what they think. And so I think, you know, I just get so excited about this research. Like I just, it just thrills me with what the potential is. But we have to always remember there is working in the background, this self-talk that we often can't do too much about, and being conscious that there are people with real concerns about what this means on a day-to-day basis for them and the reality of it.
Mm-hmm.
Edwin, do you want to chime in here a little bit about your experience? Because you're very much dealing in that space of risk screening rather than for a disease, and dealing very closely with, you know, families making decisions. What's your kind of experience and insights here?
So we, in the screening program, measured anxiety using the STAI before screening, immediately afterwards, and then after return of results. And essentially you find the same thing that is observed in many other settings, that people's anxiety goes up when they've had a test, and particularly if they get an increased chance result, and then it goes down over time to pretty much baseline. But there are things that can then spike it up, for example, making a reproductive decision. And that's kind of fairly uniform across all sorts of different circumstances in which people do these kinds of studies, I think. It's certainly true that as a species we're not terribly good at handling risk and uncertainty. And so you really have to try and manage that as best you can, accepting that you can't. You know, there are limitations on our ability to communicate, and I've had conversations with people where I've communicated a 1 in 4 risk, and by chance learned that they walked out of the room thinking it was a 3 out of 4 risk. And you know, you think you know how to communicate stuff like this, but even a very simple basic proposition like that can be misheard and misunderstood in the context of all the stress that people are feeling, or maybe I'm just not very good at it. It's hard for people to absorb and understand information, and even when they understand it intellectually, they don't necessarily believe it emotionally.
I think that's really kind of important. I guess we'll throw it out to the challenge to everyone here is, you know, we all have a piece to play in this education and support, and every stage of screening, whether it's contemplating, you've gone through it, you've got a result and you're now monitoring, that education and support piece is going to be crucial for everyone, and how we position this, the key messages people hear, and the vibes even around it is really going to change people's perceptions of things, how you internalise it, how it feels, not just what you know. And I think that's going to be a challenge for everyone here, is what you take back to your departments, the sentiments you sort of feed through and, you know, through your communities and networks. Everyone has a piece to play here. And with that, I do kind of want to move to the education piece, because Marian, I almost want to propose that there's a paradigm shift prior to all of your paradigm shifts, that I don't even think the stages of type 1 diabetes and the idea that there are these early stage pre-symptomatic stages exist. I don't think that's well known in our diabetes community at all, in our diabetes health professionals even, let alone primary care. I think we actually have a big narrative shift here that we need to make around how does type 1 start? If you look at the websites, and I'm going to kind of call some people out here, that their websites still say it's a rapid onset. It's not. But that's what we're telling people, is that how do you screen for something if it's a rapid onset? So we actually have a huge education piece that we need to do before we can even screen. And I guess I'm going to challenge this group to take that back and try and start making some of those changes. But I guess anyone on the panel kind of want to talk to that about your experiences, Marian, potentially overseas, or Gina or Jenny, or even Renza, about how we filter that information through and change something that people have thought they've always known.
It's hard. I mean, we've tried a number of things. We've tried Facebook and information plastered to buses and trams in Denver, and campaigns in movie theaters, and direct mail to providers. There are so many misconceptions about type 1 in the community that, you know, when we approach many families with the idea of screening, they say, well, my kid plays soccer and is not obese. Why would I worry about diabetes, right? This is the typical answer. And actually, its best selling point for our screening was adding celiac disease screening to the mix. People are much more interested in getting screened and their kids screened for celiac disease, not for diabetes. So I think there's an ocean of ignorance around us in the community about type 1. And you remember how hard it was to educate the community about COVID, right? How much resources were spent, how many talking heads on TV. And still there was a large part of the society that didn't believe anything what was being said, and didn't want to follow the rules. So I don't think it's never going to be perfect, but we have to try. We have to work with primary care providers, because they multiply the effect. They talk on our behalf if they know what to talk about to their patients, and it just helps.
Is this a bit where I get to talk about stigma? Because that comment about, yeah, we're fine being screened for celiac disease, but diabetes, no. My gosh, that's one, I mean, that is one of the big things we've got to overcome here, is the image problem of all types of diabetes. Everything gets mixed into one, and there is this real stigma associated with all types of diabetes. People don't want to think that they've got to worry about it, because that's something that that's other people, you know, that's not what my active family has to worry about. But I think that there are real learnings in that. Happy to be screened for one thing, but not for another. How do we overcome that? But to your point about changing discussion around the stages of diabetes, I mean, that does need to happen with health professionals. I know that I've seen that being presented, and most of the health professionals in the room who are not diabetes people had no idea. They were shocked by that. So how do we, you know, often the changes though come in community. You know, presenting this to people with diabetes is really important, that this is part of the conversation when you're explaining what diabetes is.
And just a plug, we are putting together a position statement with all the diabetes organisations to try and recognise these stages. It's been out since 2015 in the US as a joint statement. We need that in Australia.
So I just have a question to the panel. So I think we, as Marian eloquently said, we are at the beginning of a shift of a paradigm, right? And I think that in our Western medicine, we often wait for a treatment until, well, the diseases are advanced, and disproportionately, small attention is given to prevention. So we do have this philosophical approach towards medicine overall. My question is we have enough data and evidence to show that there is years of underlying destructions of beta cell that's happening, and we're still treating at the time when that's irreversible. So data is here, but for me is a question to the panel is what would be the singular thing that you think would be of the highest importance to actually start shifting this approach? And there is a lot of things which we discussed, but we do have to kind of plan a roadmap of how that's going to happen in the next decade. And we have to be realistic potentially about the time frame it's going to take. But I think we need to have a vision of how that's going to be achieved and what would be that singular thing that we have to start, or is it 3 things that we have to start that will be working together? Is it that we need to have more treatments or much more awareness in terms of all those different things? But I think we need to really try to prioritize our approach.
Who wants to start?
Well, I mean, I think what you need is a cost-effectiveness argument, ultimately. And so it's going to be a mix of how accurate and cheaply can you do the screening, you know, and what the uptake and all of that's going to be, and then what the point of that is. Now, you know, we think, well, the best thing we're doing at the moment is preventing people going to hospital, but we don't know that for sure, really, and there might be cheaper ways to prevent that, and we don't know what the cost saving of that is. So I think, you know, a piece on data to try to get that together and maybe to find areas where you can pilot specific interventions to try and address that might be one way to go. And then, of course, you know, obviously having a prevention is going to be really important. And again, it's going to come down to the cost and the impact of that intervention. And we're clearly a long way from having any argument that we've got something that's cost effective at the moment. And so, you know, I'd be interested in other people's views as to whether you would go after, you know, improved health, soft landing, less hospitalisation versus, you know, intervention to mean that you don't get ultimately your diabetes complications. I think the former is probably the way to sell it initially.
Gina?
Can I say from the Helmsley perspective, what we're looking as the next step is, it has been proven in the research environment that you can do screening, but the reality is to go to the next level is to incorporate it in the services of a health system. So in the US, we support one big project in Sanford, which is a huge health system in the northwest of the States that covers a couple of states. And they are trying to identify, and they have been successful, how do they integrate screening in their everyday clinical care. And they start from genetic screening, and then they follow up with antibody screening, autoantibody screening, as the children grow. And I think all that we're talking about, I think it's what you said, Dorota, it's a shift paradigm, and you see all these problems. But at the end, if this is if autoantibody screening or genetic screening, it gets integrated and has an environment that the families feel that there is a medical care, there are people who understand what is type 1 diabetes, and at the same time there is a community that supports all these people. I think for me this is the next thing that we're trying to do. Monitoring and clinical care, I think it's the next big thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's, you know, something we're looking at in the pilot at the moment is, you know, that monitoring aspect, because we know that screening without monitoring doesn't prevent DKA. So that monitoring piece, as you say, is huge. I know John's super keen, Avani's keen, we're looking at it as well, and that's part of that clinical care. I'm conscious we're kind of moving into the last section, but I do want to kind of look into the primary prevention piece as well. And I want to think, Jenny, this might be a good question for you, but how can we actually deepen our understanding of primary prevention and move from associations to causality?
Well, I mean, we know of primary prevention that it's going to have to be very early, don't we? I mean, and we feel we're further ahead with secondary prevention at the present time, but and almost with that, if it's going to be very early, it's going to have to be pretty safe. I mean, there's just so many things you can do in pregnancy. There's so many things you can do in the first 2 months of life. So, I mean, causality requires the associations we're seeing in our cohort studies obviously require follow-up with trials, which I sort of touched on when we thought through that.
So in terms of causality, I think we need not only clinical trials, but a vaccine for primary prevention. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a virus and we need a vaccine for that virus, but something that can be given to the whole population of infants, and something that can be a partnership between industry and the government. You realize that the companies don't want to make vaccines unless it's COVID vaccine, and there are billions of dollars available for the company to benefit. Vaccines are a difficult area because of the lawsuits and the potential side effects, but without big investment from industry, it's not going to happen. And the same for secondary prevention in people who are antibody positive. It would be great to have a pill rather than a shot or infusion, which would make it widespread and easy to apply. But again, we need industry partners. And is there any from industry in this room? Let me ask. Raise your hand. Sanofi. Oh, great. Bravo. So we need more companies at the table. And you know, this is the story of insulin pumps and CGMs. Until Medtronics and Dexcoms were formed and invested billions of dollars in R&D, it was just a research area we were talking about, you know, over and over again, and nothing was happening. So this is what needs to happen.
I mean, just to add to that too, I think, like secondary prevention, it's going to be different primary preventions, because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Marian, but I think in the Teddy study with the prolonged seeding in relation to autoimmunity association of enterovirus, I think that was about 11.8, just under 12% of children had that prolonged seeding preceding autoimmunity. So it was still a relatively small proportion who you might argue potentially could be helped by the vaccine. I mean, it's hard to completely say that, but it's not going to be that's not going to be the pathogenesis for every child. It's going to be for some.
Right, but we need a proof, just like with cow's milk. There was a group of investigators who very strongly believed it's cow's milk that is causing type 1 diabetes, and there was a triggered trial, and end of story. We need those answers either way, yes or no, and move on.
Bill, do you think we have enough evidence that a virus is truly a trigger?
So
there's actually, I'm going to add to that because there's a great comment from the audience wondering about the benefit of giving enterovirus vaccine to the general population. Do we just vaccinate everyone?
Look how well that went for COVID. If you go back to screening and the Juergen and Wilson and the white criteria and everything, the difficulty you have with viral pathogenesis and an intervention is that it's more complex. So we've moved on past those criteria to a multiple hit over time criteria, and so it doesn't even fulfil Cox postulates because you've got to modify Cox postulates to show that it occurs. So you've got to have a very sophisticated and nuanced conversation about the answer to that. I'm a virologist, of course it causes diabetes. And, you know, Maria and more recently Ki Wook and I have been working on this for 25 years. There are very nice enterovirus vaccine trials ongoing now that I think will provide a very good answer to that question. No, you shouldn't vaccinate the whole population against enteroviruses at this stage, because you need the evidence from those trials, and enteroviruses are a ubiquitous part of your gut environment. They're called enteroviruses because they live in your gut. They are normal parts of your gut flora, so a vaccination program for everybody will have, as it did with COVID, adverse consequences, and those will probably kill any enterovirus vaccine far too early at this stage. We have no doubt, and Kiewuk alluded in his talk to our PhD Sonia Isaac's paper, which clearly shows, with all the nice molecular data, that enteroviruses are a contributor. We knew that 25 years ago because we knew that there were at least a couple of patients who clearly had it. However, is it just a couple of patients out of 8.5 million? Is it 6 million out of 8.5 million? Until you answer that, you can't really do your screening, let alone a vaccination criterion. That doesn't mean that we don't see that as an end result, but we're going to have a far more complex and nuanced conversation that the people who make the decisions, who are the companies and the politicians, won't understand until we are clearer about our outcomes. And if you look at the screening criteria, let alone the vaccination criteria, you have to have defined tests, you have to have defined outcomes, you have to have a defined intervention, and those things aren't yet present. They may be in they're not going to be in 5 years, but because we won't have the results until then. But if they are in 5 years results that show a critical change, then the impetus for that becomes much stronger in 10 years.
And is that a bit of a lean then towards a genetic screen because you can vaccinate early before seroconversion? You can do some of these interventions that are sort of 2 months or 6 months of age.
It's more complicated than that because you don't seroconvert to enteroviral infections because our assays aren't good enough to pick up that seroconversion, because there's, in Kiewuk's talk, he talks about 106. There's probably 2 or 3 times as many enteroviruses species in our gut. So it's, there's still stuff to be worked out. On the other hand, that's not a reason not to do vaccination trials in populations now to provide those data to inform that. And if we can develop mRNA vaccines within kind of 12 to 18 months, then we've got VLP, we've got whole killed vaccines at work. There's no reason that you couldn't do that with enteroviruses. They're a very good target for that.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to throw out to the audience. We've got just the last couple of minutes. Sanjay, I wanted to pass to you first, and then to Renza.
Yeah, very, very interesting discussion, and obviously Dorota's point of prioritization will be very, very important for JDRF and for others as well. I have a question/suggestion, and I don't know if this is a paradigm shift, but knowing what we know about type 1, how about introducing more type 1 education in medical school, in primary medical school? Because I think I was told that the total lecture on type 1 is 1 hour in a 5-year med school. And so now, 20 years fast forward, educating them when they're bright and young, before they decide on a specialty, would probably go a long way as a parallel track to everything else that we're trying to do here. That's a suggestion, and I know there are many people here from the unis that can make that possible.
Well, I think I've done the lecture for type 1 diabetes last 30 years in our medical school. And I have to be very positive here. I think there's been a big change. I always stop on the stage 1, 2, 3 study, which has gone from sort of the George Eisenbarth to the green to the trial net. It's developed over time. But I now ask them in a show of hands who's seen this before, and it's getting almost 100%. So something's changing. I don't know whether they're getting this in internal medicine, because there's obviously paediatrics, but and of course we're obviously slightly biased towards telling them this in our department. But look, I have to be very positive about the medical students. I think the last couple of years there's been a big change. I don't know what other people think about their medical students.
So Jenny, just a comment. We have been doing a lot of focus groups recently, especially with the launch of T1 Detect and other programs here, Ask and everything else. In most of our interactions so far in the GP community, pediatricians, as well as in the endocrinology community, less than a third of them know that type 1 has stages. This is in the United States. Maybe people are brighter here. But less than a third of the clinicians know that type 1 has stages.
There's a bit of a gap, obviously before medical students become subspecialist pediatricians, but I do think certainly that's our experience, and the last 5 years have been a change. Yep.
I Jenny, do you want to take?
So I wanted to come back to both Jenny and Marian talked about BMI and the relationship of BMI to the likelihood of, getting type 1 diabetes. And, this is the same in rheumatoid arthritis, and we focus not on BMI but on nutrition. And we can influence BMI and the outcome of, the relationship of the dysbiosis in the gut with changing nutrition towards a more healthy Mediterranean-style diet and with physical activity. So is anyone trying to get an evidence base around these interventions and influencing the impact of BMI on diabetes early in life?
I think, Marian, do you...
Well, I can say only that we, from DAISY, we had published in a couple of papers proved that the diet, it's slightly off your question, but relevant. The diet with high glycemic index precipitated progression from autoimmunity to clinical diabetes. And we've been trying to get this clinical trial funded for like 7 years. Nobody wants to fund it, not even JDRF or Helmsley. So it's, and Jill Norris is a world expert in dietary factors for type 1, and she cannot get it funded. So with BMI, it will be the same. I'm afraid that there's such a misconception that BMI is type 2, and what are you talking about? Clinical trial to keep our infants lean, right?
It comes back to all the things you've been talking about. It's something proactive that people can do. If there's an evidence base, then it's much easier to sell, and nutrition is easier to sell than weight loss. I can tell you as a clinician. And if there's an evidence base, it's much easier than if there's not. So things have changed in the field of rheumatoid arthritis because we have that evidence base.
I mean, I think, Reggie, the data we got from the Australian Baby Diet Study with Peter Coleman and Lynn Harrison was weight Z, which is the under 2-year-old equivalent to BMI Z over 2. So the weight Z was very much that first 2 years. And so, of course, the infant start is a little different, obviously, and breast milk doesn't necessarily mean you're actually not putting on weight. In fact, there are babies with accelerated weight gain on breast milk feeding as well. So it's sort of quite a difficult sell, actually, exactly what you do about that. And I mean, we're also obviously interested in the pregnancy, the fact that, in the modern environment, there's a very high rate of obesity and overweight at conception in both fathers and mothers. And it's not a sexy topic, there's no doubt. In the sort of funding arena, there's no doubt intervention for that. But I agree, I think it's been underestimated, that opportunity.
I sense a lot of inertia because of the type 2 problem.
It's a sort of...
We need to change it. I mean, it's something that it's staring you in the face, besides viral infection, as being a key contributor, and genetics. You've showed the genetics.
Okay, I'm going to draw this panel to a close because I think there's no other questions. I
want to ask the viral.
I was looking for the microphone.
I want to ask a sort of ignorant question on virology and type 1 diabetes to the virologists. There was always this suggestion with multiple sclerosis that it might have a viral etiology, and then last year in Science they published that Epstein-Barr virus probably is the explanation for many, if not most, all people with multiple sclerosis. Do you think that the technological revolution that unmasked that issue in multiple sclerosis, that could be adapted to type 1 diabetes, or has it been adapted and they just didn't find that link?
The short answer is yes, and it's if you'd like to call it a quits, that's the answer. But the problem, as lots of us have published, is that when you get something like next generation sequencing, you then have or as Kiewuk's doing, the virome, you then have a sort of logarithmic leap in your requirement for complexity of understanding, and that's what's happened with EBV in terms of looking at response. And the problem is these are ubiquitous viruses. EBV's ubiquitous, 90% seropositivity in the room. So you have to have ways of sorting it out. That's what they've been able to do, and that's what we're now able to do, except instead of a double-stranded DNA virus, it's not very variable. We have a couple of hundred highly variable RNA viruses, and so that increases the complexity. So you need bigger computers and more money. It'll come, yeah.
All right, very last question.
Should we change the name of type 1 diabetes?
No.
Excellent. No, please continue.
Well, I think looking at Renza here, but would that help with community uptake if we called it something like autoimmunity of the beta cells or something along the six? Get away from the whole diabetes tag and slightly version.
I am but one voice, but I'm a pretty loud voice on this, let me say. So I was diagnosed 25 years ago with IDIM. And then it changed to type 1. No one knew what IDIM was. Nobody knew what type 1. I knew nothing about diabetes before I was diagnosed. Nothing. There was a girl at my school who had type 1 and my primary school. I didn't know anybody with it. I think we can change the name. Of course we can. We can change the name. But again, it won't make sense to people unless they're directly affected by it. And I just feel like the effort it would take for that, I feel could be spent doing far better things.
But I feel like the confusion with type 2 diabetes is unhelpful in a lot of the things we're trying to do in terms of early diagnosis.
I think we need to deal with the stigma of all types of diabetes. I think it's a stigma issue. It really is. We have a role to play when we're talking type 1 diabetes, that the way we speak about it is that we speak about it in a way that doesn't throw type 2 under the bus, because actually that really impacts also how type 1 diabetes is perceived. But I think that we're making real strides into the way that we are trying to address stigma and the way that we define diabetes in a way that we really try to stop finger pointing and stop blaming people. I think we need to just keep doing that. But I feel that I genuinely don't think that it would make any difference, because apparently there are 4 types of MS. I wouldn't have a clue what they are. I know one of them because Bartlett from West Wing had one type. I can tell you what he has. Wouldn't know about the other one.
And this is the future. If there's a really good sequel to Game of Thrones, one of the main characters has to develop stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Type 1, and then we are done.
That's how we do it.
Wonderful. All right, I'm going to draw that session to a close. Thank you, such a esteemed panel, fabulous discussions. Thank you to everyone. I apologise we didn't get to all of the questions, but I am going to pass to the next session who's going to continue that. But I think there's a lot of call for action for the whole group here. Everyone has a piece to play. This is more than just one thing. Although we need one goal, we do have lots of pieces to the puzzle as well. So thank you.